Okay, the cat and the dog are out, or the cat went out and the dog suddenly refused, having a mind of his own. Should we have pro-dog movements? Well, never mind. Okay, now um, on page 320, one of the things that the Linda Nochlin, the writer of the article, a woman philosopher, by the way, one of the things she wrote, and I think I will add, I think that having women in philosophy would make more balanced male philosophers because they would get a different viewpoint that's equally valid viewpoint and needs really, you wouldn't, what would Nietzsche have been like if he had known one woman philosopher? I think he would have been a bit saner than he was, frankly. Okay. Let's see. Where do I start? Here's an example of how institutions discourage women's participation in art. Central to the training programs of art academies since their inception in the late 16th and early 17th centuries was life drawing from the nude, generally from the male model. In addition, groups of artists and their pupils often met privately for life drawing sessions from the nude model in their audience or in their studios. In general, while individual artists and private academies employed the female model extensively, the female nude was forbidden. Not going to have any naked women around, although naked men were all right. Why is that? I can't even understand it. Which tells, well, at any rate, how far out of date am I? Or not probably too much. So, the female nude was forbidden in almost all public art schools as late as 1850 and after, a state of affairs which has rightly been designated as hardly believable. Far more believable, and here's the point, I think the biggest point, was the complete unavailability to the aspiring woman artist of any nude models at all, be they male or female. I never quite realized that particular fact. As late as 1893, lady students were not admitted to life drawings. What if women could see nudes? They would lose all self-control and the family would die and, that kind of thing. Society would degenerate into chaos if women could draw from nude figures. Do you believe that? Well, of course you do. Even when they were admitted after that date, the model had to be partially draped. Yes, a draped model. The plethora of surviving academies detailed painstaking studies from the nude studio model and the youthful work of artists down through the time of Seurat and well into the 20th century attest to the central importance of this branch of study and pedagogy and in the development of a talented beginner. One of the things you should do is do drawings from actual human bodies, beings. Why? Because there are many shapes and forms and structures and perspectives and tones and other things that you will get that way and be able to deal with straightforwardly when you come to paint or do sculpture or whatever it is that you may do. Okay? From copying drawings and engravings to drawing from casts of famous works of sculpture to drawing the living model. And here's the point. To be deprived of this ultimate stage of training meant, in effect, to be deprived of the possibility of creating major artworks and having a career in art. If you couldn't do that, your likelihood of being a painter was down way low in the percentile level. I didn't recognize that. Perhaps you didn't. But it was one of these social or institutional limitations on a woman and it is only in my lifetime. Kindly old Dr. Gunter, who's hung around 83 years, lived when, in the 1930s when I was born, women were having a terrible time getting to draw from the nude. Many places they could begin to do it, but it was just a beginning. Okay? Unless one were a very ingenious lady indeed, or simply, as most of the few women aspiring to be painters ultimately did, one restricted oneself to the minor and less highly regarded fields of portraiture, genre, landscape, or still life. Now, why are these less highly regarded? That's a good question. The modernist art certainly would degrade them still further in significance. And I don't see why, for example, landscape shouldn't be a perfectly valid form of art. What's wrong with nature? Said the environmentalist. Why can't nature be an equally valid object of art? And we have in the West particularly, but nowhere in the Orient, a distaste for nature as opposed to man. And for many years, people talked about the war on nature that was necessary for progress. Well, we won the war, now we keep killing the object. All kinds of problems of sex and of male versus female come up in the very structure of our business world, for example. Okay. The question, so I'm now over on page 321, still reading to you. The question of availability of the nude model is but a single aspect of the automatic, institutionally maintained discrimination against women. It reveals both the universality of the discrimination and its consequences, as well as the institutional rather than individual nature of but one facet of the necessary preparation and equipment for achieving proficiency. One could equally well have examined other dimensions of the situation, such as the apprenticeship system. The academic educational pattern in French especially was almost the only key to success. In France, if you wanted to be an artist, there are certain things you had to go through, and women were systematically excluded. And I get the picture that people just haven't thought very much about it. That's the way things are. We accept the way things are, and so that's the way things will be. So what? One of the things that Linda Rokelin, the author of this article, is saying is that the reason there are no great women artists is because of a series of institutional prohibitions that she would have to face at every level. And until she could get through certain doors, she was very unlikely to have a chance. Could there be a female Picasso? People take Picasso as the great artist of the 20th century. I like Picasso, but I don't know that I would rate him that high. And people rate Andy Warhol high, and I wouldn't. But whatever you take to be this great artist, one wonders whether if the institutional arrangements had been different, there would have been some so-called great women artists. That's the position I would take, but it's not the position that the feminists take. Why? They hate the notion of great artist. They think that it just, well, for one of them, all of them have been men, so far as we know. Now, suppose we found out that Shakespeare was Welsh. Oh no, the English would go into hiding. Can't have that. Or Irish, well, of course not. But at any rate, suppose that Shakespeare turned out to be a woman, or a committee of women. Even worse. And I admit, I've never served on a committee that I thought was worth that something actual human beings should engage in, or as little as possible. It's an open question as to whether, if women, say starting in the 18th century in Europe and Europe's offshoots, had no institutional roadblocks, whether there might have been women, great, so-called great with a capital G, women artists. I don't know, but I think it could have been. It might have been. Would there have been as many? I just don't know. I don't know. But certainly there would have been many more women in the arts. The Germans had a saying that dealt with all this in 3 words or 4. Kirche, Küche und Kinder. Church, kitchen, and children. That's the woman's place. It isn't that the woman's place is just in the home. In the home, she is restricted to not doing any paintings. And the Germans had a way of being rather forthright about this. So, what's wrong with the concept of the great artist? And in both the what we're reading now and the article on the next article in the next lecture called Gender and Genius, we'll keep talking about that. This is something that you learn, I don't know, you almost have to absorb it. One of the very lucky things that happened to me was that I was able, not exactly that I didn't work towards it, but to study for a couple of years at Cambridge University in England. And I learned a lot of things, not in class, but by talking to people. In the 17th and 18th centuries, pretty much if you were a composer of music, you were nobody, I mean, and men, you'd be male or female, it wouldn't have mattered. People would mention that you had composed a certain piece of music, but you would not have been a cause célèbre, you would not have been a celebrity, you would not have been famous. You would have been sort of like somebody who does pottery and does very good pots. Maybe you'd attach your name to them, but you wouldn't be much noticed. I think where that changed historically in Europe and the nations derived from Europe was with Wagner. Wagner was the first composer to wave the flag of genius. I am the greatest living genius, and no one can touch the hem of my garment, to use a scriptural example. And I should be feted and fed and clothed, and I should be made rich, and when I need money, I should ask for it, and people should give it to me. That's the way Wagner operated. And so with Wagner, you get the full-fledged picture, almost a caricature of genius and self-proclaimed genius. Because a lot of artists prior to that would have been thought of doubtless as good craftsmen, but not so much as geniuses. And in the midst of this, another problem that is not addressed in contemporary art, what is the function of religion or religious experience or mysticism or all of that? Because in the 19th century, as organized religion declined in its power and its influence, people proposed art as that which could take its place. And really, you see this somewhat in Wagner, who treated himself as a prophet, and in Nietzsche, who treated himself as he who has learned from the prophet. That is, what you have in people who hate religion very often is a religion of their own. And I think that needs to be widely recognized, but the point being that when you talk about the artist as a great artist, often this has religious or semi-religious overtones. Well, if you exclude religion from people's lives, are they likely to make one of their own? Yeah, I think so. I think so. In various ways, people are religious, I think, by nature, which doesn't mean that by nature they belong to a church and have dogmatic theology. But there's something in man that turns towards religion because of the kind of creature that we are. Ah, such a flawed creature. So what is a great artist? I think that Professor Laughlin believes there really isn't such a thing because the reason somebody is a great artist is because of the social context that they found themselves in. Is that the whole truth? Then if that were the case, Grandma shouldn't have been a fine dress designer because she was born in a log cabin in the hills of Tennessee. You do not get excellent training in clothing in a context like that. I picture her getting, say, the Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Ward catalog and just assiduously going through it, and magazines taken up with the clothing. But that really was a case of, is it nature? Is it the social context you find yourself in? Or is it because, as Immanuel Kant had argued, and we've read Kant, that someone has a gift? Let me give you the other example of not my grandmother, but my grandfather, Lewis Morris. Since his father deserted, he was from the Blue Ridge in Western Virginia. And since his father deserted the family when he was 9 years old, he spent his life as a boy, kicking around trying to get jobs so he could send money back to his family, which was very nearly starving. And he wandered down to Texas because there were jobs in Texas. Stopped up here at Gainesville. And there's a lot of neat stories about how he managed to make a living. But he was illiterate. He couldn't read or write. He was innumerate. He didn't know how to use numbers. And Grandma taught him how to read and write and use numbers. But he says, and I've heard him say it many times, and I don't know if I mentioned this in class, but I think it's worth restating, that the minute as a boy he saw a blueprint, he could see the whole building just rise up in front of him, with the electricity connections, with the sewage connections, with the water connections, with the stairwells, with the heating system, with the cooling system. It's just like one of these magic books when you open it up and the building rises up, usually some bizarre castle. That was what he could see. That wasn't environment. If anything, he had an environment where he shouldn't have had that ability. I remember him talking about getting shanghaied. He went down to New York City to see the city when he was like 14 years old. Was given a Mickey, knocked out. When he woke up, he found himself on a ship where he was to be a cabin boy. And I would see him sitting there on a night of a blue norther and just shaking his head because he remembered the cold night on the ship in the North Atlantic when he had to carry things back and forth from one part of the ship on the deck to the other and was freezing. That kind of background doesn't make you what he was. Really was a kind of architect. And if you showed him a blueprint, he could build you the public building, he could build you the house, he could build you the church. That was genetic. He was born with that. I've often wondered why the hell. I ended up in philosophy when all my people were, ranchers and construction people and engineers. I think it's genetic. There was something wrong with my brain. And the first time I saw it, sat in on a philosophy class, there it was. That's what I had to be. Well, so be it. And the question I'm raising is an ancient one. What is nature and what is nurture? If I'm right, you're not going to be a great anything unless you have the genetic background, which makes it possible. But then it makes a huge difference if you have the right social context. And so what context is that? When you find women artists who, Marie Cassatt, Rosa Bonheur, a couple of women painters, very good, very capable, and you find out, you look at my wife's grandmother was a novelist, and well known in her time. We still have copies of her books. And you see how different the two families are. Her people were couth, and mine were not. I'm not going to say we were uncouth, but we were not couth in the way that these Bostonians were. And we hate them. Anyway. What's my point? Now let me see if I can find this. So this would be on page 322. Okay, up here at the very top of page 322. From the legendary sculptor Sabina von Steinbach in the 15th century, who, according to local tradition, was responsible for the portal groups on the Cathedral of Strasbourg. And cathedrals then were public art projects, and by which I mean not only they were public art, but people would work in the stonework, and people would work in the glass work, and people would work in various parts of it, that the whole community tended to build the cathedral. So if you then did what was her name? Sabina von Steinbach, and did the figures, she was a sculptor, at the introduction to the cathedral. This was a very big thing. You had to be really somebody before they would let you do that. So she just lists a bunch of these people. Maria Robusti, daughter of Tintoretto, Lavinia Fontana Artemia Gentilici, Elizabeth Sharon, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and Angela Kaufman and Jo Beth Smith. I just added that. All without exception were the daughters of artists. So they, in effect, grew up in an artist's studio. Okay, if a lot of women had the opportunity to grow up in an artist's studio, do you think there would have been more women artists? Sure there would. Sure there would. Would some of them have been great? Could be. Could be. One of the good things that feminists are doing is going back and finding these people who we have forgotten. Okay. Let's see. Berthe Morisot was closely associated with Manet, later marrying his brother. Marie Cassatt, or Mary Cassatt, based a good deal of her work on the style of her close friend Degas, precisely the same breaking of traditional bonds and discarding of time-honored practices that permitted men artists to strike out. In the second half of the 19th century enabled women with additional difficulties, to be sure, to strike out on their own as well. Many of our more recent women artists, like Susan Valadon, Paula Modersohn-Becker, Kate Kollwitz, and Louise Nevelson, and I admit to my shame that I only know Kate Kollwitz, these have come from an artistic background, although many contemporary and near contemporary women artists have, of course, married fellow artists. So is it the context, the social structures that have kept women from being great artists? There certainly is a good argument. The more you explore it, the more you see that indeed Yeah, that's likely that we would have had more women composers. My favorite in this case is uh, there's a German composer by the name of Robert Schumann who became mentally ill and could no longer compose. But she helped him with many of his compositions, and she herself, Clara Schumann, whose name was Clara Wieck. You ever hear of Clara Wieck? Well, now see what good you're getting in this class, being educated in every damn thing except aesthetics. Well, we'll get right back to it. But she did some very fine composing, but her life was dedicated to her brother's career and the fame of what he did, and he was surely a genius. There were two Germans, Schubert and Schumann, and you're supposed to like Schubert and not like Schumann. I like both, but I like Schumann better, so there's something wrong with my taste. So, if you do investigation of women artists, or of women who have a kind of artistic ability, those who've been able to do something with their art have come from an artistic background or been able to get to one. And the institutions have held against that. Now, is there something wrong with this notion of the artist as a genius? Professor Nochlin, somewhere talks about some soup, I don't know if it's Campbell soup or some other soup, which would have in it a golden nugget. I don't know if that was a piece of gold. I suspect it was some of the food in the. But if you could get the golden nugget, you had the right soup. And so she talks about genius as a golden nugget that men had and women didn't. So QED here in the middle of 319. Women do not have the golden nugget of artistic genius, but men do. So if you So she wants to get rid of the idea of genius because she doesn't believe in it, but even more so because it is harmful to the woman's right to be an artist if she has the ability and the desire, as much as a man. And we're a long way from achieving that kind of equality. There is a glass ceiling in business world against women. Some break through it, or I think sneak around it. But in the science world, I take Science magazine, very unusual for a teacher of aesthetics, and I've taken it for 50 years. And there are a lot of things in today's Science magazine in which women in the sciences complain that they don't get preferential treatment, which is fine, but which they don't get equal treatment or less in the sciences. I was a bit surprised to learn of that. Because scientists, as opposed to other human beings, are supposed to be rational and intelligent and capable, and not like artists who are deranged or something or other. Okay. So what then do we make of the notion of genius? Now we've got about maybe 10 minutes left. So let me just raise two questions. Should we get rid of the concept of genius? I know a musician in the music school here who comes from the European background. He doesn't want to be called professor somebody. He makes his students call him maestro, master. And the guy's very bright and very talented, and I never talk to him but what I don't learn something about the arts or music or Russia that he came from. but do we need to be called maestro? I sometimes joke when people say, what should I call you? I said, well, Your Excellency. And they just do a complete blank out. What? What, Your Excellency? No, that's a joke. That's a joke. Should we get rid of the idea of genius or master or maestro? And second, is that idea of genius entirely mistaken? And I think that, I'm familiar with art schools and music schools and with architects, and I've washed around enough in this world to have talked to a lot of the people in them and watched how they operate. I think we've had too much of the idea of genius. Yeah, some people have a great talent, but we tend to take certain people like Picasso and build them up and ignore other artists who may have been just as talented. Maybe Matisse was nearly as talented as Picasso. We should then hear as much about Matisse, or nearly so, as we do about Picasso. And then of the artists in America who were involved in the painted word, do I have to take Andy Warhol as a genius, as I might Picasso in another context? Do I have to take Jack the Dripper, Jackson Pollock, as a great genius? See, the names get built up, but this denigrates or deposes other people who might be quite good, but who don't have that great big shining flashlight that says genius of the age. And so I sometimes think that the word genius would be better if we just dropped it from the English language and simply dealt with people who had ability and talent, rather than talking about genius. Because I think, in a way, that Linda Oakland is correct, that a really exceptional artist, it's not just a matter of heredity and of a gift, but also of environment and the possibility that gives you of utilizing it. Why have there been so few great writers come out of Texas? I belong to the Texas Institute of Letters, in case anybody wonders. I bet you never heard of it, so you never wondered. And so I've gotten to know the literary establishment in Texas as much as I can bear. And what do I think of Texas great writers? There aren't any. Maybe John Graves, maybe one or another. Some good Texas novels, but no great Texas. I think it's because the culture in Texas is anti-art, basically, and anti-intellectual, basically. And it's hard to get beyond it and make a contribution to the culture. Well, at any rate, yes, I think we should downgrade the notion of genius and forget about it. Get it out of the language. But second, what is there to it? And then what part does heredity play? What part does environment play? If you had been a behaviorist in the 20th century, or if you had been a Freudian in the 20th century, two great schools of absolute certainty that would allow nothing else in psychology but themselves, which have now disappeared entirely. Well, there are still Freudians, there are still behaviorists, but they would have said we are entirely the creatures of our environment. But it isn't so. Your experience and your opportunities have as much to do with what you become as whether you have the genetic endowment to have done certain things. And so you really have to have both. And so in the lecture coming up, we'll keep talking about this. I hope this isn't an example to talk about that bores you. I really hope it isn't. But it plays a significant role both in feminist art and in the whole notion of art. Too many people think that art, and I think the ordinary person is very likely to think that the artist is someone who's walking along and suddenly they're levitating and there's this strange light around them and they have this supernatural, oh, I now know. Way more important, and this is true with philosophy, and it's why I haven't been using it much this semester, but always give students a philosophical dictionary and try to get basic figures in philosophy and basic distinctions in philosophy over to you. If you want to be a philosopher, there's an immense technical background you have to have. If you want to be a composer, well, we'll talk some more about this then in the next lecture, in which I will then talk about natural geniuses. What are they? Or maybe I won't talk about geniuses at all, just about some remarkable people and what they managed to do in their world. So then we'll get together next time and I'll make some further assignments for you and we'll talk about how we're going to rig this course. You won't have to take the final in this course. You can take the first 2-hour exams. We'll give you the average of that grade and you can take that as your final grade on the course, or you can take the final exam. Or you can take it just to take it and see what grade you get. Either way, that's where we'll go from here.